we left the story with the Buddha having gained full and perfect awakening as the morning star rose. And today we're going to look at the 7-week period after the awakening. But just before I tell the story of that, this is a period of the Buddha's life that there are multiple different accounts of. It's very, very hard to even kind of fuse together a kind of consistent narrative of what happened, and it's a very kind of mythic kind of narrative as well. So yeah, bear that in mind. I've kind of pieced together a kind of rough structure, but this structure changes in virtually every text. It's very, very different in different versions. So this is very personal and a very poetic rendering of this part of the Buddha's life, and very personal reflections on it as well. So after the awakening, the Buddha sits in meditation under the Bodhi tree, absorbing his experience, and for the next 7 days he sits cross-legged at the foot of the Bodhi tree, absorbed in deep meditation. And towards the end of that period he reflects more fully on conditioned co-production. His mind clearly formulates the workings of conditioned co-production. And then he steps up from his meditation seat and he takes a few steps away from the Bodhi tree, and he looks back at the Bodhi tree, and it's said that he gazed at the Bodhi tree with unblinking eyes, the eyes of the serpent, they sometimes say, for 7 days, with an intense feeling of gratitude to the Bodhi tree for providing the shelter for the awakening to take place, for providing the context for his awakening. So he just gazes with intense love and gratitude for a whole week. In the 3rd week after the awakening, some say the Buddha paced mindfully up and down, again a few yards away from the Bodhi tree. Some say a miraculous jewelled colonnade appeared, or a golden bridge, and some say this was to show to the gods that and the devas and the spirits that he'd gained full and perfect awakening, and he walked backwards and forwards along this golden bridge or jewelled colonnade. Some say in the 4th week after the awakening, he dwelled in a jewelled chamber, in a jewelled room, reflecting on the Dharma, and his body emitted 6 coloured lights, 6 colours of the rainbow. And in particular, he reflected upon the Abhidharma, the intricacies of the Abhidharma teachings. Others say in the 5th week after the awakening, a wanderer someone walked by and came across the Buddha, still in the area around the Bodhi tree. And he's described in the text as a haughty Brahmin. He's a haughty Brahmin who asks the Buddha about who he is and what he's doing and about his view of the world. And it's also said that this was the time, in fact, when Mara's daughters appeared, that Mara's 3 daughters appear much later than other accounts, and they tempt the Buddha with their seductive wiles, and yet again they're seen to be impermanent. The experience of their aging dissipates their seductive effect, and they don't disturb the Buddha anymore. In the 6th week, some say the rains came, some say unseasonably, some say the beginning of the monsoon rains. And we've met the Nagas earlier in the story, these serpent dragons. And the great Naga king, Muchalinda, rises up from the earth as the rains beat down, and he coils his body 7 times around the Buddha. And his cobra-like canopy forms like an umbrella over the Buddha's head and protects him from the rains, from the deluge. And then once the rains stop, Muchalinda uncoils himself from around the Buddha's body and miraculously transforms into a golden youth who then bows and pays reverence to the Buddha. And then at the end of the 7th week, this whole time the Buddha stayed within the kind of precincts of the Bodhi tree. 2 merchants who are in a caravan of goods are informed by the gods and the devas of the Buddha and his awakening, and they come and they pay reverence to the Buddha, and they provide food, they provide alms. In some of the accounts during this whole period, the Buddha hasn't eaten. He's fasted for a whole 49 days. As we heard in other accounts, he had his 49 portions of rice milk. But in this particular version, the merchants give him his first meal of honey and rice cakes. And they become his first lay disciples. They bow to the Buddha and they take refuge in the Buddha, but they don't take monastic ordination. And some say he plucks a hair from his head and he gives them a hair as an object of their veneration to take with them. And they go on their way, and the Buddha is left contemplating how he will communicate the Dharma, how he will communicate his awareness to others, which we'll explore tomorrow. So we'll leave the narrative there. Now, as I said at the beginning, it's quite a curious part of the story in a way, and it's often overlooked. And I was reading one academic account of this period, and they said it was quite interesting that it's a period that doesn't appear so much in Buddhist art. So the Muchalinda incident does, that appears quite frequently. It's such a strong image. I'll say more about that later. But and they wondered whether it's because it's quite, the narratives are very different in different versions, and also there's fairly kind of interesting esoteric kind of imagery that's going on here. So I'm going to try and unpack some of that and give some personal reflections on what the significance of these might be for us. I think it's really interesting to begin with that that it's referred to as a retreat in some of the texts. It's interesting that it's referred to as the Buddha having a retreat or being on retreat. He's retreated from the world. And there's this great difference in the timescale between 1 week and 7 weeks. And in some versions, this is a time where basically the Buddha formulates all those lists, all those kind of different ways the dharma is sort of formally communicated. He kind of works it all out in a way during that 7 weeks, which I suspect is a mythic literalization. All the scholarship seems to suggest that the way the Buddha communicated the Dharma evolved through his whole life and kept evolving, kept changing. Which I'm sure, again, we've all experienced in our own life. Our thinking about an issue or our way of experiencing something does change and does evolve. But I find it more interesting to view this period. I find it really interesting that it takes place within this sort of precinct around the Bodhi tree, and he at these various kind of, I will say it, it's almost feels like the sort of stages of the cross or something. It's kind of it's like a drama or a ritual or a piece of theatre where he moves around this kind of ritualized space, and he seems to almost create a mandala. He creates a kind of mandala of practice, moving to these different spots with this sort of central axis of the Bodhi tree, of the world tree. And this is an image that appears in a lot of different mythologies, where there's the world tree providing the horizontal axis above and below, and then there's a spatial arrangement around that. Some say that's the basis of the stupa. The stupa is the combination of the world tree and a mandala. And if you look at the base of a lot of stupas, they actually form a mandala. So it's this kind of ritual theatre. I'm reminded of that phrase of Sangharakshita's, the drama of cosmic enlightenment. It feels like something's being kind of worked out, or maybe represented in a mythic way. So, yeah, these stages, I mean, hold them quite loosely, because they do vary and different things happen, and I won't include everything because there's too much to include. But so there's this basic first experience of just meditating, of just absorbing the experience, of just sitting. He's become awakened, and he just sits there and he just absorbs what's happened. And then I find it really interesting that this looking back at the Bodhi tree, I find it interesting. It feels to me almost like he steps away and looks back. He gains a different perspective on his experience. He almost reflects. He looks back. He reflects on his experience of the Bodhi tree, and he's been reflecting on conditioned co-production at the end of the first week, and one of the just obvious products of any kind of reflection on conditioned co-production is is gratitude. I mean, when we reflect on the fact that everything arises dependent on gratitude, on conditions, gratitude just arises. I mean, there's, in a sense, it's just common sense, that we realise how utterly dependent we are on conditions for everything, absolutely everything. You've only got, I'm on a very mundane level. You can look around your room now, and I mean, someone dug the clay out of the ground to fire the brick that built the room. Somebody designed that building. People built it. Every object in your environment has been created by someone. There's a massive amount of, think about the wood for the bookshelves, someone managed that forestry, someone cut the tree down, someone milled the wood, someone transported it, someone constructed a set of shelves, someone transported it to a shop or directly to your house, someone wrote the books, someone produced the paper. It's just endless, absolutely endless, the myriad of actions that have come together to create our world and have come together to create us. And it seems a natural response to feel enormous gratitude for all that, for the miracle of what we've got. And it's also quite a profound, well, it's the most profound teaching, but it's profound in the sense of it also communicates our vulnerability, how completely vulnerable we are, how completely dependent we are. And I think one way of looking at the awakening and the Buddha's life and the Buddha's vision of life is this constant turning towards and dwelling in that vulnerability. He's completely kind of open to life, because normally we just can't bear that vulnerability, and we want to make ourselves secure, we want to make ourselves safe, we want to sort of shore ourselves up against the shifting sands of existence. But the Buddha totally turns towards that sense of vulnerability, and he can dwell in that vulnerability and not in a creative, open-hearted, loving way. It's the triumph over fear in some ways. It's the triumph over fear. And that, ironically, is the greatest security. I remember seeing as a teenager Alan Watts's book, The Wisdom of Insecurity, and the title somehow really spoke to me. I never quite got on with the book, but the title, The Wisdom of Insecurity, has always stuck with me. It's always stuck with me. And then there's this image of pacing up and down along a jewelled colonnade or a golden bridge, and this idea that he's kind of convincing the gods that he's gained awakening. I'm not entirely sure the Buddha needed to convince anybody that he'd attained awakening. But I find, one, it's quite interesting that maybe there's a period of walking meditation, or just on a very mundane level. Maybe the Buddha's just practicing walking meditation. Maybe the gods look down upon that and rejoice. I don't know. But I find it interesting that this image of the bridge, that he's along a golden bridge, and it, as it were, taken less literally, it connects him with the gods. And I wonder whether this image could be read as a way of communicating how the Buddha's consciousness, his mind, his experience, his being is so vast that it includes the whole of existence, all the sort of the layers of this sort of multi-story universe we live within. And this bridge, awakening, kind of connects, it creates a connection with the highest realms of conditioned existence. that the gods and the devas are seen as in the kind of traditional Buddhist cosmology. Because something similar happens. I mentioned earlier in the retreat about what I find is particularly lovely image of the Buddha going and visiting his mother in the Tisha heaven a little later. And she's died, of course, just after he's been born. And it's said that there's this either sort of ladder or staircase that he climbs up to the heavens. And in some of the versions, that staircase not only extended all the way up to the heavens, but it extended all the way down to the hells. And it's said that it's the first time in history that the heaven realms and the hell realms kind of directly connected with one another. And again, I find this a really beautiful image of this notion of awareness, of awakening, including everything, connecting everything up, joining everything. Nothing's excluded. Nothing's kind of not within the realm of awakening. Nothing's too lofty and nothing's too lowly. Everything's included. Another image of integration. There are these countless kind of images of integration. And then we move to the fourth week and this jewelled palace. And in some ways, you think, if you've ever had one of those kind of experiences where sometimes it can feel with practice like you are in a jewelled palace, those meditations where it can feel like you're in everything sparkles, everything shines, there's a luminosity to experience, there's a richness to experience, there's a credible beauty to experience. It sort of sparkles. And it's also said, that his body emits these kind of coloured lights at this time. These coloured lights are traditionally said to sort of represent the different kind of qualities of the awakened mind, of wisdom, of confidence, of equanimity, of purity, etc. And it seems very similar to the acquiring of the rainbow body that happens in the Tibetan tradition. But again, I wonder if it's something about his whole being, his whole body communicating the dharma, his whole being radiating. It's interesting we use that term, don't we? That you might have fortunately experienced it yourself. You come off retreat or something, and someone goes, "Oh, you look radiant." Or you meet someone who's got a very, very deep dharma practice, and they've got a kind of glow about them. That's something that's often in the accounts of people meeting the Buddha is he was sort of said to kind of glow almost. He had a kind of radiance about him, and there's a real literalization in this image of someone literally kind of radiating light. We use that expression, it's like they radiate light. Someone's whole being communicating wisdom and compassion. And then there's this was quite interesting little scene. This kind of this Brahmin sort of wanders onto the stage almost. The haughty Brahmin. Again, it's got the makings of a sort of classic drama, hasn't it? You've got somebody meditating in their jewelled palace, and this sort of this kind of fool sort of figure wanders in to provide a bit of comedy and a bit of light relief. And he's haughty and whoring. They've translated it in some of the versions, slightly old-fashioned use of English. And it's said, that the Buddha is sort of perfectly polite to the Brahmin, and he's very respectful. But it's interesting. He explains to the Brahmin that a true Brahmin is someone who practices the dharma. A true Brahmin it's not something that one inherits through family history, through ancestors, through the caste system, some sort of spiritual status in the world. That one's status, one as it were, is through one's actions in the here and now. You can't rely on who your parents were. It's about who we are in the here and now, how we relate to others, how we relate to ourselves, our ethical conduct, our awareness, our mindfulness, our wisdom, and that's so. And this, in relation to Indian society and the caste system, is actually quite a devastating reply. I find it quite interesting that the accounts say, how polite and respectful the Buddha is, and yet his reply completely undermines an entire worldview, an entire sort of construction of a society that is deeply unjust and has caused a vast amount of suffering to a vast amount of people for a vast period of time. So he's completely questioning the caste system, which is a very extraordinarily radical and even revolutionary act, but done with this kind of sort of politeness, which I quite like. And the Brahmin goes on his way. And also, I find it interesting at this period, it's also said that this is actually where Mara's daughters appear. This is actually where they appear. And I do wonder whether there's a possible suggestion here, to hold this very lightly, but I do wonder whether it suggests that the aversion that's embodied in the attack of Mara, these forces of hatred coming towards the Buddha, or that aspect of the Buddha's mind that he's integrating and seeing through, whether there's a possible suggestion in this that craving, the transformation of craving, may come a little later along the path. Because the thing about hatred and aversion is actually we all, although sometimes terribly, hatred and aversion can be almost enjoyable, after a while it's a deeply unpleasant experience, isn't it, to feel real kind of hatred and aversion to somebody. It really curdles and sours our whole experience. And as the Buddha famously said, it's like holding a hot coal, isn't it? It's like this image of throwing a hot coal at someone, but you burn yourself in the process with hatred and aversion. Whereas I think with craving, it's harder to see the suffering inherent in craving, because you're craving, you're enjoying yourself, as it were. It's often harder, I think, to see through craving because it's so seductive, embodied by these seductive daughters. And of course, as I said yesterday, you can replace daughters of any gender and none, or whatever it is that embodies craving for you, whoever that may be. But yeah, it seems to come a bit later, maybe, in practice. That might be a wrong view, I don't know, but I think there's something to dwell upon around that. And you can also, it's a very clear illustration of how there's no one tradition, there's no one linear narrative of all this stuff. We have this sort of vast array of eyewitness accounts that are often a little bit contradictory, and we're trying to sift through and get a feel rather than a definitive sort of literal truth. And then we have this image of the rains coming and Muchalinda rising up, the Naga king Muchalinda rising up, coiling his body around the Buddha's body and protecting him, and this hood of protection. And then the transformation into golden youth. And I've put on the shrine here a representation of a Naga encircling the Buddha. I've said quite frequently on this retreat about this image of the redemptive power of water. And again, this kind of redemptive rain comes down, this sort of soothing, washing rain, which you can imagine in the parched landscape of India would be very welcome. And that image appears again and again in the narrative. You know, it appears in the ritual bathing before the awakening. It appears at his birth with the shower of water. It appears again and again, this image of the cleansing power of water. And the response is the arising of this extraordinary image of this serpent-like energy coming up. The Nagas are very much associated with energy. They're said to be an embodiment of energy, particularly sort of subterranean, chthonic, deeper energy. They're also associated with storms and the ocean. Famously, Nagarjuna is given the perfection of wisdom teachings from the bottom of the ocean by the Nagas. And this suggests a certain kind of intuitive way of experiencing, an intuitive way of knowing. It's intuitive energy. These unconscious energies. Interestingly, Sangharakshita once described the Nagas as being morally neutral. The way energy is morally neutral. It's what we do with our energy that's significant. And in this particular narrative, that energy rises and it coils around the Buddha's body. And I think of this a little bit like, for those of you who know about electric motors, an electric motor is coils of copper wire, thousands and thousands of coils of copper wire. And that multiplies the energy. So a coil is an image of the kind of concentration of energy. Some people directly connect this with the rising of Kundalini energy, the sort of serpent energy that rises up the spine in yoga and certain yoga practices. And then goes through the 7 psychic centers of the body, the chakras. So the 7 coils connect with the chakras. And also this image of the spine, almost like the world tree, and the image of the serpent spiraling around. In the Western tradition, we have the staff of Asclepius, this Asclepius, who's the father of medicine. And I find it wonderful that we still have that image on pharmacies and ambulances in the UK and other places. That I love the fact that even in our scientific, materialistic age, these ancient symbols are still there in the background, and we're still responding to them in a way. So the staff. So you've got an image of strength, and you've got an image of fluidity, a little bit like I've been saying about the image of the tree and the river. The Naga being this sort of serpentine, fluid energy that's rising up. And some have interpreted this as the energies the whole of the energies of the Buddha's psyche, but rising up from the awakening experience and being integrated. And as I've said, we often experience this with practice, don't we? That practice releases energy, and it can release more energy than we can skillfully handle sometimes, and we can become ebullient or intoxicated or get into inappropriate relationships and all sorts of things. So that energy needs to be kind of managed quite kind of carefully. And perhaps this image of Muchalinda transforming into a golden youth and bowing to the Buddha is a representation of the alchemy that's taken place. There's literally a transformation of that energy into gold that's of service rather than controlling. I said yesterday in one of the sessions about that aphorism, that which is kept out controls. That which is kept out controls. But in a sense, that energy has been invited in, and it's of service to rather than controlling from the unconscious. And it provides this protection, this hood of protection before then, which again is a very beautiful image. That we need that strength, that power sometimes, that aspect of our minds, that the power to say no, the power to protect ourselves, maybe the power to set up boundaries, as the coiling does. So there's a huge amount, I think, in the very, very rich imagery in the Muchalinda episode. And then we've got this final image of the arrival of these two lay disciples, these two travellers, these two travelling merchants. And I find it really interesting that these first contacts are with what you could term ordinary people. They're not other wandering ascetics. There's an interesting the Buddha's first contact with a wandering ascetic is quite interesting, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. But I do find it interesting that there's these he meets ordinary people, just ordinary people going about their lives first off, and the first experience of the haughty Brahmin, he doesn't come across as being very receptive. But these two merchants are, and they make reverence to the Buddha, and they give him alms, they give him food, they give him these rice cakes and honey. I love these little details you get in the tradition. And it's interesting that they give food. Again, it's quite ordinary. Well, we all need to eat. They provide the basic stuff of life. They provide the basic stuff of life. Because food, I think, is, as we all know, has a great emotional charge for many of us. And food often gives our experience ballast. Often if we're feeling kind of ungrounded or insecure, we're looking for ground, we're looking for something, we'll eat. I know I certainly will. My particular, I find I really crave carbohydrate. I want some sort of heaviness. And sometimes I think that's to sort of block out my experience, to sort of lay a kind of duvet of food over my mind, to sort of make it a bit more bearable. And at other times, I think there's a very human need just to feel kind of grounded, of being in the world, of being, in the stuff of life. And that's what food does, really. And it's interesting, they give him food, and he's almost like it's an image of the Buddha coming into contact with the wider world again. he's taking food and he's meeting these wandering merchants, and he's coming more in relationship to the wider world. And it's very natural and normal, and there's a kind of just ordinariness about it, I find. But I find it really interesting that these are lay followers. They don't give up everything and go forth and follow him into the wandering life. But they can they get a sense of something of the Buddha. They respond to something in his being. They as the aphorism goes, Buddhism is caught, not taught. Buddhism is caught, not taught. And I get a feeling of these two guys kind of really catching something. I talked about my experience of coming along to a Buddhist centre and having the thought, I don't know what they've got, but I want some of it. And I wonder if this is the experience of the merchants. They meet this man and they think, I don't really understand this, to be honest with you, but there's something special about this guy. There's something about him that I respond to. And if it's to be believed, and the Buddha does pluck out one of his hairs and give it to them, it's interesting that he's already beginning to communicate the Dharma in a way that's appropriate. So he offers the kind of path of reverence and veneration. I mean, that could just be a whole justification behind a whole pilgrimage site based around the Buddha's hair, which is a distinct possibility. And also it could be seen as a justification of the whole lay monastic split that has been a bit of a koan and paradox for the whole of the Buddhist tradition about the relationship between the full-time monastics and the lay community and the tensions that sometimes create. So it could be the beginning of that. But it's a lovely image. So I think of this whole period as stabilising the insight, as a period of absorption, of digestion, talking of food, a period of sort of psychic digestion. The Buddha doesn't leap up and rush off, screaming eureka into the surrounding countryside. He just absorbs his experience, a little bit like deer do this. They have a ruminative, is that the right word? Ruminative digestive system, where once a deer, some mammals do, where they have two stomachs, and they, after a deer's eaten, it finds a quiet spot and it sits down, it lies down and it digests. And you often don't see them because they kind of tuck themselves away, and it's kind of there's echoes of that in what the Buddha's doing. He's digesting his experience, perhaps. And obviously for us in the modern world, it's so tempting, isn't it? Particularly with the internet, you can just leap from one thing to another, to another, to another, and we do this. And the need for times when we just do nothing and digest, it's so important. And the need for retreat, to retreat from the world. And this is something that the Buddha manifests in his life. And he does this as part of his day-to-day experience, and he does it through a longer timescale as well. In his day-to-day experience, I find it really interesting that he had these periods of, depending on the different accounts, but he'd wake up and he'd meditate and he'd go on his arms round in silence, and then he'd eat. And then in different accounts, sometimes and again, he has this period of literally digesting his food that he's criticised for in some accounts. It's seen as sort of being lazy to allow one's food to digest. Why isn't he fervently practicing all the time by seen by ascetics of other traditions? But he allows his food to digest. And in some accounts he meditates again, and it's only then much later in the day, probably for pragmatic reasons as well, the cool of the evening, that he actually then starts to engage with people and communicate the Dharma. But his day is balanced between a kind of internal resourcing and a relational aspect of going out and relating to other people. And he kind of keeps those two aspects of himself in balance. And obviously throughout longer periods, he'd have times where he'd go off and have periods of solitude and retreat, particularly during the rainy season. So there's this stepping into the wider world, and there's this stepping into a more reflective, contemplative inner experience, and there's this sort of fluid movement between those two. And he's able to manage his energy. I wonder this whole period is about the management of energy, just as Muchalinda embodies this management of energy. That there's a management of energy going on, because it is so easy. Particularly we come off retreat, and you're full of energy. You're all charged up, and it's so easy to kind of blow it. It's so easy to overdo it. It's so easy to not manage our energy particularly well. And those transitions, it's so important to manage those transitions. And I do find it, just one last thing, significant that he doesn't leap up and start teaching, that there is this period of absorption. He doesn't leap up and start communicating the Dharma. I actually personally try and avoid the word teaching because it has certain connotations to it. I prefer communicating the Dharma. But he doesn't leap up and start communicating the Dharma immediately. And again, in the modern world, in the past, people would quite often do quite long apprenticeships, or they'd actually start sharing their experience much later in life when they've got quite a lot of experience under their belt. But it seems to be a particular modern phenomena that we leap into sharing our experience often very, very quickly. And there's something to be said for that. It brings us sometimes new and fresh perspectives on things. And it can also mean that things aren't fully digested. We haven't really fully digested material. I think it's so important with the Dharma, and it's been a theme of this whole retreat about, I do feel very passionately about finding ways of really digesting the Dharma rather than what I call cut and paste Buddhism. You can go onto the internet now, can't you, and you can just cut and paste. So and so says, somebody else says this, literally kind of, and voila, you've got a manifesto, you've got a Dharma talk, you've got something where it's so important that we do look around and read things, but it's so important to reflect and to digest and to, and then when we come to communicate the Dharma, then hopefully it has a flavour of ourselves, a flavour of our perspectives, our way of being, and it's been tested, as it were, tested in the world, tested against our own experience. So we all need these periods of digestion and reflection, And I think it makes the Sangha much more rich and interesting if we're communicating as much as we can from our own experience. Obviously, in relationship to the tradition, it's a fantastic resource, and it would be a bit foolish to sort of throw it all away and just rely on ourselves. But we can, we need to reflect on things. So it's almost a little bit of an interlude in some ways, in the rather eventful interlude, I have to say, but it's a sort of an interlude in the Buddha's life story. So I'll give you some reflections, and then we'll have a tea break. And I mean, what are we grateful for? I mean, such a brilliant practice to have. I once heard somebody say about the value of an attitude of gratitude. It's kind of snappy. It's so easy to see the world in sense of what we haven't got, what we've missed out of, a sense of lack. But we're rich. We're richer than we know in some ways. We've got that jewel sewn into the hem of our gowns. And I think a very interesting question is where is our energy flowing? What are we drawn to? No judgment on that. It's just really interesting. What do we respond to? What do we look at? What does excite us? What does get our energy moving? That might be traditionally dharmic things. It might be something else. But it's quite interesting that when we reflect on these things, they can be very revealing. That things that may seem quite mundane, for example, might actually have very deep roots, as it were. Might communicate a lot to ourselves. Where is our energy flowing? And very, very simply, these what supports our practice? What do we need? What is this mandala of? What would our mandala look like? What would it be? What would it include? Where would these different points be? What do we need in our life just to create a life that's sustainable? So there's just 3 reflections for you.